The morning sun spilled across the rolling hills of Derek Carter's ranch, painting the grass in shades of gold. Normally, mornings like this filled him with peace. He loved the quiet hum of nature, the distant lowing of his cattle, the rhythmic squeak of his windmill, the smell of fresh earth after an early dew. His land was more than property. It was his sanctuary, his pride, and his proof that hard work could build something lasting. But that peace shattered when Derek walked to the edge of his property and stopped dead in his tracks. A fence. Not the wooden kind ranchers used to keep livestock in, but a towering metal monstrosity, steel bars that gleamed harshly in the sunlight, stretching as far as he could see in both directions. It was new, clean, and deliberate. At the center of the barrier stood a massive gate with a thick padlock dangling like a dare. Derek's stomach dropped. He hadn't ordered this. Nobody had asked his permission. His land had been walled off like a prison yard overnight. What the hell is this? He muttered, running his calloused hand over the cold metal. His reflection stared back at him, confused, angry, and already calculating. The crunch of shoes on gravel broke the silence. He turned to see a group of people approaching from the paved road just outside the fence. They were sharply dressed, clipboards in hand, the type of people who had never spent a day working the land. At the front was Margaret Whitfield, the head of the neighborhood's homeowners association. She was in her 60s, but carried herself like royalty, chin lifted, eyes sharp, lips pressed in a thin smile that always seemed one insult away from showing her teeth. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone polite but dripping with superiority. Derek folded his arms. "Care to explain why there's a damn wall around my property?" Margaret glanced at the others before replying. "The board convened last week. We've determined that your ranch, while charming, does not fit the aesthetic standards of the community. The fencing ensures compliance moving forward." Derek blinked, stunned. "Compliance? You fenced me out of my own ranch. It's for the betterment of the neighborhood," Margaret said smoothly, as if she were talking to a child. "The cattle, the equipment, the rustic appearance, it all lowers property values. This fence provides regulation. If you need access, you'll have to go through us." One of the board members, a younger man in a pressed suit, stepped forward. "HOA authorization will be required for entry going forward. We'll provide you with request forms." Derek let out a bitter laugh. "Request forms? For my own land?" Margaret's smile tightened. "Mr. Carter, please don't be difficult. Rules are rules. You chose to buy property within an HOA-controlled community. You knew what that meant." He took a step closer to the gate, gripping the steel bars so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes locked on hers. "What it means is you people think you can control me. You think you can fence me out of land I worked my whole life to build. But let me tell you something, this ranch doesn't belong to your committee. It belongs to me." For a flicker of a second, Margaret's mask cracked. She wasn't used to being challenged. But just as quickly, her expression hardened. "You'll find resistance only makes things harder," she said coldly. "It would be wise to cooperate." Behind her, neighbors had gathered, watching the confrontation. Some whispered nervously, others smirked as if enjoying the show. Derek noticed the glances, pity from some, superiority from others. He was the lone rancher in a community of polished lawns and trimmed hedges. To many of them, he was an outsider, someone they tolerated but never truly accepted. He stood tall, letting the weight of their stares roll off him. His father had taught him long ago, never show weakness, not to anyone who wanted to take from you. "You've made a mistake," Derek said evenly, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "You think this fence keeps me trapped. But all it's done is show me exactly who I'm up against." Margaret tilted her head. "Is that a threat, Mr. Carter?" "No," Derek said, stepping back from the gate with a calm smile. "It's a promise that I don't break easy." He turned and walked away, boots crunching against the dirt, every step measured. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, unaware of the storm brewing. Derek glanced back once more at the gleaming fence, the padlock shining in the sunlight like a taunt. They thought they had boxed him in. What they didn't know was that fences don't just keep people out, they also reveal where the weak spots are. And Derek Carter was already planning how to break through. The days that followed were suffocating. What had once been an open stretch of land, free and alive, now felt like a cage. Derek Carter had spent years building his ranch into something worth being proud of, but the HOA's steel fence turned that pride into a daily humiliation. Every errand, every chore, every responsibility now depended on the whim of a lock, and the people who held the key. The first morning after the fence appeared, Derek drove his pickup to the gate, a trailer of hay bales hitched to the back. His cattle were hungry, waiting beyond the barrier, but the gate stood locked and silent. He honked once, twice. Nothing. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, Margaret Whitfield strolled down the path, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other. She didn't rush. She didn't even pretend to be sorry. Mr. Carter, she said casually, you'll need to submit your request for access at least 24 hours in advance. I'm afraid we can't have people coming and going whenever they like. It disrupts the order. Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Those cattle won't wait for your paperwork, Margaret. They need to be fed now. Margaret sipped her coffee slowly, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of control. Then perhaps you should have planned better. Next time, follow the rules. She finally unlocked the gate with a delicate twist of the key, stepping aside as if granting him a favor. Derek drove through, glaring in silence, every muscle in his body tense. But that was only the beginning. Over the next week, the games intensified. One evening, Derek rushed to the gate after a storm rolled across the ranch, lightning splitting the sky. A section of his irrigation system had burst, and he needed to shut it down before it flooded his crops. But when he reached the padlocked gate, a different board member, a tall man named Harold, stood there shaking his head. Sorry, Carter. No access after hours without written approval. It's an emergency, Derek snapped. If I don't fix that system tonight, I could lose half my crops. Harold crossed his arms smugly. Not my problem. Maybe next time, attend the HOA meetings instead of ignoring them. Derek's fists clenched. He wanted to swing, but he forced himself still. Losing his temper would give them exactly what they wanted, a reason to fine him, penalize him, maybe even push for eviction. Instead, he inhaled sharply and said, "You'll regret this." By the time Harold finally relented and let him through, Derek's boots were soaked in mud, and the damage to his crops was already done. The harassment spread beyond the gate. Letters appeared in his mailbox daily, citing violations, the placement of his barn, the number of cattle on his land. Even the color of his tractor shed. Fines stacked up, absurd and inflated. Neighbors who once waved politely at him now avoided his eye, whispering behind closed curtains. He was becoming the HOA's scapegoat, their example of what happens when you refuse to cooperate. But Derek didn't fold. He endured the humiliation with a silence that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Late at night, he sat at his kitchen table, papers spread out before him, bank filings, HOA budgets, property deeds. He read every word, every clause, every overlooked detail. Years of running a ranch had taught him discipline and strategy. They thought he was just a rancher, but he had another side to him, a sharp, calculating mind that knew how to find leverage. Margaret and her board thought they held the power because they held the key. What they didn't realize was that Derek had already started searching for the lock that controlled them. One afternoon, the confrontation came to a head. Derek stood at the gate again, this time with his cattle pressed against the fence on the inside, restless and mooing. They'd broken through an interior post, and he needed to round them up before they injured themselves. Margaret was already waiting, arms folded, a mocking smile on her face. Perhaps if you paid the additional community fees we discussed, Mr. Carter, the HOA could be more accommodating, she said sweetly. Derek tilted his head, studying her carefully. His blood boiled, but his voice came out calm, deliberate. You think you've boxed me in. You think this fence is power. But all you've done is give me time to study you. And I've learned something important. Your control has cracks in it. And when I find the weakest one, I'll break it wide open. Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before she regained her composure. Idle threats won't help you. Derek leaned close to the bars, eyes locked on hers. Who said anything about idle? He stepped back, letting his words hang in the air. The cattle stirred behind him, the sound of hooves thudding against the dirt like a warning drum. Margaret didn't answer. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her expression. Derek turned and walked away, already planning his next move. The HOA thought they had broken him down. In reality, they had only sharpened him. And he was done playing defense. The HOA clubhouse was spotless, as always. White walls, polished hardwood floors, framed photos of smiling board members shaking hands with city officials. It was the pride of Margaret Whitfield's rule, a place where she could preside over her carefully groomed kingdom. On this particular evening, the board had gathered for a special meeting. Margaret sat at the head of the long table, her pearl necklace gleaming beneath the bright chandelier. Around her, board members shuffled papers and muttered about budgets, landscaping violations, and Derek Carter's increasingly disruptive behavior. "He's testing us," Harold, the tall board member, said. "If we let him get away with ignoring fines, others will follow." Margaret raised a hand, silencing the chatter. "Mr. Carter has underestimated us. He thinks because he's stubborn, he can outlast the HOA. But he doesn't realize we always win." She allowed herself a small, victorious smile. "And when he breaks, we'll be ready to swoop in and buy his property for pennies." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. That was when the double doors creaked open. Every head turned as Derek stepped into the room. But this wasn't the Derek they knew, the rancher in dusty jeans and boots. Tonight he wore a tailored suit, dark and sharp, his shoulders squared with authority. His eyes didn't dart nervously like they expected, they locked onto Margaret's with steady confidence. Margaret's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "Mr. Carter," she said stiffly. "You are not on the agenda." "Actually," Derek replied, his voice calm but commanding, "I am the agenda." He walked the length of the table slowly, deliberately, the sound of his polished shoes echoing off the walls. At the head of the table, he set down a thick folder and tapped it once with his finger. The board members leaned forward, curious. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What is this supposed to be?" "While you've been busy fencing me out of my own land," Derek said evenly, "I've been busy doing something you didn't expect. I studied your budgets, your loans, your filings with the county. And you know what I found?" He slid a paper from the folder and laid it flat. Margaret reached for it, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Her eyes flicked over the page, and color drained from her face. This isn't possible," she whispered. Derek smiled faintly. "Oh, it's very possible. You see, the HOA hasn't exactly been the picture of financial responsibility. Turns out you've been behind on payments for this property, the clubhouse, this land, even the very gate you used to lock me out. And when the bank got tired of waiting," he pulled a keyring from his pocket and dangled it in the air, "they sold it to me." The room exploded in gasps and frantic whispers. Board members leaned toward one another, papers rustling, voices rising in panic. Harold sputtered. You bought the property. All of it." "That's right," Derek said smoothly, enjoying the shift in the air. "As of this morning, I am the legal owner of everything your little empire sits on. This clubhouse, this land, and most importantly," he let the keyring jingle once for emphasis, "the only gate key." Margaret's chair screeched back as she shot to her feet. "You can't do this. We are the HOA, we set the rules." "No," Derek said firmly, locking eyes with her. "You set rules when you had control. But now, the only way you get into your clubhouse, or hold your precious meetings, is if I unlock the gate for you." The board fell silent. For the first time since the fence had gone up, Derek was the one standing taller, his voice the one carrying authority. Margaret's lips trembled, but she forced out, "This is outrageous. We'll fight you in court. You won't get away with this." Derek leaned forward across the table, lowering his voice until it carried a razor's edge. "You built a fence to keep me out. But what you forgot is fences work both ways. Now you're the ones locked out, and I'm holding the key." He straightened, collected his folder, and turned to leave. The board sat frozen in stunned silence, their power crumbling like dry soil beneath a boot. At the door, Derek paused and looked back. Meeting adjourned. Then he walked out, the sound of his footsteps echoing like a gavel striking justice. The sun beat down hot on the blacktop road that led to Derek Carter's ranch. Dust swirled in the air as cars pulled up one after another, forming a frustrated line outside the towering steel fence. Mercedes, BMWs, SUVs with gleaming chrome, all idled in the heat, their owners climbing out in suits and pastel summer dresses, fanning themselves with HOA pamphlets. At the front of the crowd stood Margaret Whitfield, her pearl necklace glinting like armor, her face red not just from the sun but from fury. She pounded her fist against the cold steel bars of the locked gate. "This is unacceptable," she shouted. "You cannot keep us from our clubhouse. We have official business to conduct." Behind her, board members muttered and fumed, their whispers sharp and nervous. They had grown used to control, to being the arbiters of rules and fines. Now they were the ones standing outside the fence, denied entry like trespassers. The irony wasn't lost on the neighbors who had gathered across the street, watching the spectacle. Some chuckled quietly, Others shook their heads, but all of them saw the shift. Power no longer radiated from Margaret and her board. It radiated from one man. A low rumble cut through the murmurs. From the dirt trail beyond the gate, Derek Carter appeared on horseback. His black gelding moved with steady confidence, each hoof striking the ground like a drumbeat of authority. Derek sat tall in the saddle, broad shoulders casting a long shadow, his Stetson tilted low against the glare of the sun. The crowd went silent as he approached, the jingling of the reins and the clop of hooves the only sounds. Derek stopped in front of the gate, his calm eyes sweeping over the sea of angry faces. "Well," he said at last, his deep voice carrying in the hot still air, "looks like y'all finally know how it feels." Margaret stepped forward, her voice shrill. "You're abusing your position, Carter. This is harassment. You have no right." Derek cut her off with a sharp whistle. His horse pawed at the ground, kicking up dust. "No right? Funny. That's exactly what you told me when I stood on the other side of this gate." He leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes locked on hers. "You fenced me out of my own land, made me beg for permission to work it. You laughed while my crops flooded and my cattle starved waiting on your delays. And now," he reached into his pocket and held up the gleaming key, "now the shoe's on the other foot." The crowd shifted uneasily. A few board members whispered, "Maybe we should negotiate." But Margaret, prideful as ever, only grew more defiant. "This won't last," she snapped. "We'll take you to court. We'll have you removed." Derek smirked. "You can try. But until then, you play by my rules." With deliberate slowness, he leaned down and slipped the key into the gate's lock. The crowd pressed forward, eager, hopeful, until Derek twisted the key, swung the gate open just enough to let himself through, then pulled it shut again and locked it tight behind him. The HOA members gasped in outrage. Margaret sputtered, You can't just." But Derek ignored her. He rode past the gate, dismounted, and tied his horse near the clubhouse porch, the clubhouse that now legally belonged to him. He walked up the steps, boots heavy on the wood, then turned to face them again. "You see this?" he called out, lifting the key high. "This isn't just metal. This is a reminder. You thought you could control me with fences and fine print. But I don't answer to your rules anymore. Not here. Not ever again." The neighbors across the street began to clap, quietly at first, then louder, until the sound rolled like thunder. Even some of the HOA members, embarrassed and tired of Margaret's antics, lowered their heads in shame. Margaret, red-faced and trembling, realized what had happened. Her power was gone. The woman who had once dictated the community's every move now stood outside a gate she no longer had the right to open. Derek descended the porch steps, his voice calm but firm. "Here's the new order. My ranch stays my ranch. My land stays free. And this clubhouse, it's mine now. If you want to step foot inside, you'll have to ask me." He slipped the key back into his pocket, turned on his heel, and strode inside the building. The heavy door shut behind him with finality, the echo ringing like a gavel striking justice. The HOA crowd stood outside the locked gate, stunned into silence. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time, she had nothing to say. Inside, Derek walked through the clubhouse halls, the sound of his boots steady and sure. He paused at the window, looking out at the fence that had once been a symbol of his oppression. Now, it was a monument to his victory. And every time he passed that gate from then on, he smiled, because the key in his pocket wasn't just control over a lock. It was proof that no fence could ever cage a man who refused to bow.